I'm Big Don Luca, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren.
What is up, guys?
Today, we are going to be getting into what is the Dallas Mavericks record going to be for the 2023-24 NBA season. Starting off with our slew of just complete impromptu off-season content that, none of it is based on anything that has actually been reported or anything that is actually relevant. Just a lot of stuff of basically us revisiting the past or predicting the future. Jaren, are you excited for this August dry month period of NBA content? And, given that we've already had two pretty dry weeks ever since free agency came to a downwind, and everybody is just waiting on Damian Lillard to make his decision here.
Yeah, I mean, we had a actual pretty big announcement in terms of the Damian Lillard vote today, where Shams reported the reported package of what would be needed to get Damian Lillard in Miami. But to answer your question, I'm honestly pretty excited because we have FIBA coming up, and we're going to see Luka and of course Team USA play in that tournament. So I think for that, I am excited. I believe it starts August 14th or 16th, somewhere around there. And for that reason alone, I'm looking forward to it. But in the dryness of the Sahara Desert, in terms of NBA, what looks to be NBA rumors, there seems to be absolutely nothing. So I'm not looking forward to that. But who knows? Maybe in the month of August, we see a Damian Lillard blockbuster trade to the Miami Heat eventually come into formation. But in the meantime, I'm looking forward to FIBA, and I think that's the only reason why I'm excited for August basketball.
Yeah, especially as we ramp up towards Media Day. August always goes faster than I think a lot of NBA fans give it credit for. But Jaren and I are going to take this as an opportunity to catalyze our creativity on this podcast and give you guys some content that we haven't really done before or ventured towards, just given the lack of stuff that's happening. But to Jaren's point, we will have full coverage of all of Slovenia's World Cup qualifier games, as well as the actual tournament games. So long as Luka is playing, everything that is relevant via him is extremely relevant to the Mavericks, given his position in the organization. I think that goes without saying, but nonetheless, we are excited to kick off this month with you guys, and to get into, just a slew of different things. And who knows, there could be some, major NBA trades that come into fruition, once this Lillard saga comes to its formative end. A lot of teams that initially may have not wanted to trade for X player or didn't want to exert, X asset in a trade, may be willing to do so, once they see the Heat's roster or when other certain chips across the league, become available. There's a lot of teams, restricted free agents and trades that are, I think, waiting for that to happen. So we will have up-to-date coverage on all of that stuff as it comes out, of course, along with our regular off-season content that we'll be bolstering out here. But today we are specifically going to be talking about what the Mavericks record is, of course, as I said earlier in the podcast, and, get into the betting odds surrounding that, and, talk about how that could change, if the Mavericks are able to get in on some of these off-season trades or make some moves before training camp is set here in the end of September, I believe. But before we do that, here is an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, Jaren. So getting into what the Mavericks record is going to be this year, I think a lot of people would definitely predicate the Mavericks record for this upcoming season upon what they have to do, remaining in the offseason. If they're able to potentially get another wing or even a guard at that remaining, $6 million or whatever that they have left with their mid-level exception, or if they're potentially able to get into the Clint Capella sweepstakes, if there's a sort of fallout there after the Damian Lillard trade and, guys just start getting moved off the board, say Siakam gets moved and, the Hawks need a third suitor and the Mavericks are able to take on Clint Capella or potentially another starting center. But as of right now, it seems kind of thin in terms of the moves that the Mavericks have the wherewithal to make. If we're going into this upcoming season with this current roster, what do you think the Mavericks record is? And then what would your justification for that be?
Yeah, I mean, look, you look at the active standings, I guess, or standing predictions rather, for the Western Conference, and you see a lot of teams that have the potential to make it. And there's still, we came up with this last year where there was going to be a single team that wasn't going to make the play-in at all. And that, of course, was the Dallas Mavericks. So I think, we fall into a similar situation like that with this year. I think that there's a lot of buyers and not a lot of sellers. And there could potentially be 11, 12 teams that, are looking for a playoff spot. And of course, one of those teams isn't going to be even in the play-in rather. So, if I'm going to backtrack here, and this is me honestly being kind of optimistic, I see the Mavericks being an 8th or a 7th seed, and probably winning more games than they did last season, but not many more. I think that they probably have a 500 to maybe a little bit above 500 in that 43, possibly 44 win range. I think is kind of realistic. Now, as you said, if the Mavericks do get that starting center or potentially another wing, that could change quite a bit, but as it looks right now in the West, especially, as I mentioned, there's a lot of buyers, there's not a lot of sellers. The Mavericks are on the deeper end in terms of teams that are looking to compete in the high spots of the playoffs. And I just don't see a world in which the Mavericks could potentially be that 4 seed with that current roster that they have right now. And that's honestly my justification. I might get a lot of hate for that. I understand that the Mavericks have had an amazing offseason in which they could potentially add a starting center, and this would be an A++ offseason. But as it stands right now, like I said, I really do think that the Mavericks are an 8th or 7th seed look out of that play-in tournament. And at best, I think it's a 44, 45 win team.
Yeah. I would push back a little bit. I think that this team obviously, could reach a different type of ceiling than we may expect if they're able to hit on a variety of different markers that I think a lot of people, within the fan base as well as the organization are skeptical about them hitting. I think a lot of that's going to hinge on the young players specifically. And that's not to say that they have some insurmountable sort of pressure going into this season. I don't think that the whole season, I don't think the narrative rather going into the season needs to be predicated upon, the young players and, them being able to boost the Mavericks, ability to win a championship. But the facts are blatant at the end of the day with the Mavericks current roster. If they are to be in that title contention territory, then Olivier Maxence Prosper, Derek Lively, guys like that are going to have to be, either day one, in Lively's case, probably a day one starter. In Prosper's case, obviously a very serviceable wing off the bench that, showcases a sort of Jaden McDaniels type skill set and, could be a guy that's plugged and played in certain lineups, can start at times. Those two things I think would have to happen for the Mavericks to, definitively be in title contention territory, because with Lively's probably volatility and his spottiness that, we're going to see going into his rookie season, just, given that he's a rookie big man and the track record of rookie big men being able to be, day one starting centers in the modern NBA is, pretty thin across the margins. And I think that the rim protection issue, is still at the forefront of this Dallas Mavericks team. They definitely mended some of the, defensive wing issues this offseason with Grant Williams and, Max Prosper. I think that obviously goes without saying, but, they still haven't bolstered their depth, in totality there, the way in which, you look at some of these title contenders across the board, like, say not the Suns, that's a bad example, but say like the Warriors, they have, Kuminga, Draymond Green, Andrew Wiggins, they just have, Moses Moody. They have a slew of wings that, have the ability to attack off a closeout and, pull up for a jump shot while being able to, conversely at the other end, play lockdown defense and be able to guard multiple positions. And, obviously the dimensionality of every single wing on the Mavericks is, going to vary. Sure, maybe Grant Williams is better in the short roll. Olivier Maxence Prosper is better at attacking closeouts. But as long as everybody is not one dimensional, and, I'm not saying everybody that the Mavericks have to have a cast of, just all-star 3-and-D wings that are playmakers on both ends, because those are wildly unrealistic expectations to have. And that typically only happens when, certain prospects are able to hit on markers, coming into the draft that, people have labeled as swing factors, or, guys that could, things that maybe a guy has flashed that could, change the tide of his career if he gets really good at, for instance, like Derek Lively being able to pass out of the short roll consistently, something like that. Right. But I don't think that, the Mavericks even need that, nor would it be realistic. They have, plenty of guys that can definitely be serviceable in an NBA rotation at that wing spot, as well as guys that, have to, prove that they can hang in the NBA stomping grounds. But there is, promise and credence to the fact that they could play, somewhat of a role next year, in a guy like AJ Lawson. But in the end, every single championship contending team in the modern NBA has a slew of, perimeter defense and, guys that in theory can guard 2 through 4 or 1 through 5 and, still be competent 3-point shooters at the other end, and, have some sort of other ulterior aspect of their offensive game. And, the Mavericks definitely address that this offseason with Prosper and Grant Williams, but not to the degree that some of these title contenders have, where they have 4 or 5 of those dudes. The Mavericks have like 2 or 3 of those dudes. And that's where, the deviation is for me. So I think that, bolstering that wing depth, as well as seeing, if Derek Lively is somehow, able to take the momentum that he did in summer league and apply that to training camp, as well as the start of the regular season, and become a tried and true starting center in this, in the NBA, and not, and the defensive lapses are somehow, just not enough to override the productivity that he may have. And, when I say defensive lapses, that's him, not being caught with his hands down, or being late on a rotation and, over fouling, even on offense, conversely, just being able to set a screen, and do it with a solid base and actually stay there for a second before slipping to the rim and completely negating the whole point of the action. All that sort of stuff is going to, be hugely contingent on elevating the Mavericks ceiling this year, as well as his, development on both ends. Now, I think that it's unrealistic for us to expect that as fans. And I think that we definitely need to, hamper our expectations with all of our young players involved, because it is a slippery slope when you start, placing too much stock into these young players, and, they have these games where they underperform, or, they have stretches where they're, very consistent, and, you're ready to almost forecast their future impending all-star vote. And then they have a stretch where, they don't look nearly as good, for example, Josh Green last year, with his, 3-month stretch where he looked like the idealistic, like 2 guard that we wanted to pair with Luka. Then Kyrie gets traded there. Justin Holiday comes into the rotation, and all of a sudden Josh Green, his confidence is shot. He's not playing near as well. He obviously was able to get back into shape towards the end of the season, and, really, fix some of those confidence woes or whatever was, limiting him at the time, whether it was just the injury or whatnot. I don't really know, but young players are, in the NBA in today's game are uber talented. They have a ton of skill set, more so than I think any era that we've been a part of. They're, increasingly less one-dimensional. But the developmental curve will still be something that always, still exists and is still prominent. within basketball. And I don't think that changes for the Mavericks young players. So if they aren't hitting on, certain markers that we have, set out for them, it's not something where I'm going to be extremely hypercritical going into next season. For example, if Jaden Hardy isn't really able to take that step as a playmaker and is, more so just an off the bench scorer, that could easily be something that happens. There's a lot of guys that go through sort of sophomore slumps, if you will, right? There's a lot of expectation dwindling and hampering that we're going to have to do over the next month or two, because, seeing these guys get into training camp, seeing the preseason games overseas that a lot of Mavericks fans do not agree with because of the egregious traveling schedule that it will put on Luka after his World Cup games, seeing all that sort of stuff will be vital to if this team is able, to raise their ceiling with these young players' performances, because the excitement is going to come through and fans are going to be ready to put a lot of stock into these guys. But, come day one on an actual NBA floor, things could definitely change. So, I think my biggest message, and a long-winded message in terms of what I believe the Mavericks record is going to be next year, would be, first off, to all fans to definitely just try to put a certain, cap or governor on your expectations for all the young players in Dallas this year. I'm, very excited with what we did in that department after having been to Summer League, after, having covered the draft and everything this year. It was a, great time. And honestly, probably some of the most, fun I've had as a fan, seeing the Mavericks actually improvise through the draft and use that as their main sticking point of improvement throughout the offseason. It's something that's been pedestrian to us for years. But with that, we have to understand the age of these guys and that they still are going to have a lot of growing pains that come with that. So if I had to predict the Mavericks record next season on a level-headed note, where I think that sort of middle ground is of where they'll end up landing, because I do think that they improved, obviously, like I said in previous podcasts. I think that this was, a B+ offseason. Nico Harrison did an excellent job with what was given at his disposal. Now, obviously, there are certain swing factors like getting another starting center or another wing, or perhaps if Matisse Thybulle's contract was, not matched by Portland, that could have changed that ranking. But, for right now, I'd say that they had about a B+ offseason with what they were able to do. I still think the Mavericks improve from next season, because defense was obviously the elephant in the room. And, while they addressed it, they didn't address it in the, holistic sort of way that I think everybody was, sort of penciling them in to do. But, they did address it to an extent, and they got better with all the moves they made. That's a given. So I would say that, yeah, like that 44 to 45 win range is probably where they cap out on the realistic note. But I do think, if Derek Lively somehow comes in and is at the level of a tried and true NBA rim protector, and, Prosper is able to come in and, potentially be a starter-esque type of player, or a guy that is within that top 7 of the rotation, Jaden Hardy, for instance, comes in and is able to, evolve as a playmaker, be a 6 man of the year type of candidate. There's a variety of different things. If AJ Lawson steps up in the rotation, we can go on all day with all these young players, but I mean, not one single, of those, happenstances with those young players will turn the tide of this Mavericks team, winning more than like 45, 46 games, in my opinion. Obviously, this is all relative, as, who knows exactly how the standings are going to play out next year. This is all way in advance. But if I'm, having to predict, what the Mavericks record is going to be, I don't think that they're going to get above 50 wins unless, say, 3 or 4 of those factors that I just listed in regards to the young players hitting a different sort of developmental stride than we expect end up happening. If all that is to happen, I think the Mavericks can win above 50 games. But I just think that's a big shot in the dark there. And with the parity of the Western Conference right now being at an all-time high, with it being comparable to the 2014-15 season, where we had teams with winning like 47, 48 games, missing the playoffs. I just am skeptical if, this current Mavericks roster can get above that 45, 46 win echelon. I think that's kind of where the talent kind of caps out for them, to be honest, at this stage. And that's not to say that isn't a good record in the West this year. I think that could easily be 5th or 6th in the West this year, given how much the parity could increase. But I mean, across the board, too many teams got, more than marginally better this offseason with like the Suns, and we'll see what ends up happening with the Clippers and James Harden and all that. And it's just I'd be doing a disservice to myself, and I would have to attach the homer label to myself almost by default if I said that the Mavericks were going to win more than 46 games with the current roster that they have going into training camp next year. Jaren, now that we have discussed what the ceiling is of this Mavericks team, given their current roster, say that they are able to get a starting center and yet another wing off the bench, or maybe another guard if they trade away Tim Hardaway Jr. and they choose to go that route instead. What do you think the ceiling of this team is after essentially, making all the moves that we've asked them to going into the offseason to become a tried and true championship contender?
Yeah, absolutely. And, real quick, I did want to touch back on our conversation, regarding this team as, we currently know it, this current roster. And that's without a tried and true starting center and without a little less wing depth. There is a lot of swing factors, as you mentioned. There is a lot of swing factors that go into even perhaps a 44 win season. There's a lot of reliance on Omax Prosper to come in off the bench and be a reliable wing,
even if he's not like a top
absolutely
7 sort of caliber guy in the rotation. I mean, he still has to get minutes and be valuable in those minutes. I mean, he's not a guy that the Mavericks can afford to put down in Frisco for the part of the year.
Absolutely. I think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of swing factors, that being one of them. And of course, Dereck Lively. I think Dereck Lively has to eventually work within the Mavs rotation. And if that doesn't happen, even a little bit this year, look, I'm just as excited as the next person, November, December, to probably go watch some Legends games and see Dereck Lively II play in those games. Cause I do, presume that he probably will be on that team in the early months of the season. But as we're ticking down and closer to playoffs, if he's not having a role on this team, this is the swing factor that I'm kind of more concerned about, is if he isn't playing, if he doesn't have a role. I just really don't see a world in which the Mavericks, as we mentioned, get over that 46, 45 win hump if he's not within the rotation. I think he has to have a similar season to what Jaden Hardy had. Of course, being a different player, of course, of last year's importance. So I think that those are probably the swing factors that have to go into it, specifically for Omax and specifically for Dereck Lively. But to go back to your question that you just asked, let's say the Mavericks do acquire a starting center, whether it is Clint Capella or Ivica Zubac, Jared Allen, whoever it is. They acquire someone of importance to become that starting center, and they bolster up, whether it's signing Kelly Oubre or signing someone still with that $6 million that they still have left, or getting someone back in a potential 3-team deal. We don't know yet what those parameters could look like, but let's say the Mavericks do bolster up both of their holes. I am with utmost confidence. I really do feel confident in saying this. If the Mavericks do somehow get a starting center, I think that this team could potentially contend. I think especially there's going to be still a reliance on Omax no matter what, even if they do get a wing. But as I mentioned, I think if they can get a starting center, a lot of holes in this roster get amended already. Whether it's Clint Capella, his defensive abilities, and especially on offense, his rim running. I just think that there's a lot of Band-Aids that are going to get ripped off on this team, and they're going to be healed, I guess, rather, if you're going in that sense. So I would look forward to, over a 50-win season. I'm not saying that I would be disappointed if they don't win more than 50 games if Clint Capella was added to this roster, because, again, I do think that there is some time there that, guys need to be worked in together, whether it's connection, whether it's chemistry or just on the court time. I think that there's probably going to be a level of, working in a level of time that needs to be had before these guys can be 100% comfortable together and playing on a basketball court. But even still, I think that this team ultimately becomes a 50+ win team rather, if they do acquire a guy like Clint Capella for all the reasons that I just mentioned. And I know, Will, you'll probably mention some more reasons. But yeah, I think that this team instantly becomes a top 4 team, home court advantage, all of it. And they could probably compete with maybe the Denver Nuggets, maybe the Los Angeles Lakers or Phoenix Suns. I think that those are probably the top 3 teams in the West right now. I mean, there's we can go on and on. There's so many teams this year. But in my opinion, those are the top 3 teams. But I think if the Mavericks somehow do acquire a starting caliber center of Clint Capella's importance, I think that this team could compete with those guys could compete with Denver's, could compete with LA Lakers, whoever it is. I think that this team ultimately becomes a playoff contender. And as I mentioned before, is competing for a home court advantage at the end of the season.
Yeah, I think that if the Mavericks, good health granted, I do think that they would be in that echelon. I think if they are able to get a starting center, even if they don't get a wing, they put themselves in a position to at least be top 5 in the West, because that's just too much of a drastic overhaul in terms of your defense. It gives a mentor, to Lively, a guy that can sort of vet him up to speed, and, you can sort of interchange him in the starting center. I think it would probably, I think some fans would honestly think that, Lively, not starting means that, he is going to, just play the whole year in the G League. Obviously, Jaren and I have, dispelled that. We do both think that he is talented enough to end up, at least being within the rotation by the end of the year. But I mean, a center of his caliber, as well as his measurables, don't always translate right away into the NBA. And I mean, he could experience enough growing pains, like Jaren said, to where, he's maybe buried in the G League for most of the year, doesn't have too much of a role. You don't have to worry about that whatsoever if the Mavericks get a starting center. And, I'm honestly more inclined to think that Lively would get more minutes if the Mavericks had a starting center, which sounds counterintuitive. But I think that you're able to get away with him being on the court a little more in the NBA game, see what he can offer in the NBA game with a starting center. If he's playing high value minutes as the lone big out there. And, I mean, I'm sure that, Dwight Powell or Rashawn Holmes would win the starting spot at that point. But, given your bullpen approach to the center position and, you not having a true rim protector within that bullpen of centers, really barring Maxey and obviously Lively, but, for all the defensive, potential mishaps and, shortcomings that he could experience because of how raw he is, coming in day one, you definitely just don't feel near as confident funneling, guys, dynamic playmakers and ball handlers towards the rim, towards a Dwight Powell or Rashawn Holmes. And, if Lively's not winning in those minutes, and, oftentimes with rookies, we see, pretty blatant, and egregious, shortcomings when things start to go bad. It's not just 1 or 2 mistakes. It'll be possessions upon possessions, right? You can't really get away with that as much if you're the only 2 other centers on, or 3, obviously if you're playing Maxey, if the only 2 other, or 2 or 3 other big men in your rotation to fall back on at that point are going to be Maxey, Dwight, and Rashawn. You're probably going to need to, have an overt reliance on those 3 guys. I think, with a Clint Capella taking like 30 minutes a game away from one of those guys, it definitely gives you a little bit more leniency to showcase Lively. But that's just my opinion. I mean, I'm definitely not opposed to somebody who thinks that he may see the floor a lot more, if Capella, for instance, or Daniel Gafford didn't get traded here. So I do think that, that's obviously one of the, bigger swing factors that could, bode both, negatively as well as positively to your credit, and, health as well, like I, mentioned at the top of the segment. But, overall, the Mavericks are in a extremely tough West next year, a West that will not, in my opinion, be near as forgiving as last year, given some of the injuries that we saw across the board. And the Mavericks will, have to stay consistent, from that health aspect. Seeing, of course, a full season of Kyrie in Dallas, how many games he plays, obviously at least has to be mentioned going into all of this, because yes, he just got a 3-year, $126 million contract, but and I'm a firm believer in what Kyrie can bring to this team, and I'm very confident in terms of how reliable he will be going forward, because I think that, because of obviously some of the social issues and the pandemic, back in 2021, that obviously kind of diluted the perception around, his reliability, because he's not ever been a guy who's injury prone or a guy that doesn't want to be there, for his team. I mean, he's obviously, dealt with injuries, really throughout the last year or two, but before that, I don't think everybody, anyone would label him a huge injury prone player. He's never missed like a full season of his career due to a major injury. But I would, be negligible to obviously not mention, the volatility of his playing time over the last couple of years. So, while I'm confident in him being able to, play 60, 65 games at least for this Mavericks team, that could obviously change. He's getting up there in age, of course, a little bit too. That could be a huge factor that, if he gets injured at the first half of the season, then, this Mavericks team is, a lot less thin across the margins, and, their season could easily take a turn for the worst. If really anybody between, him, Luka, and, I guess then you start sort of drip feeding into the next tier of role players. When we talk about Tim Hardaway Jr. and Grant Williams, it really, if any 4 or 5 of those guys in that starting lineup or A and B tier of the Mavericks get hurt, I mean, I think that could drastically turn the tide of the season. So there's a lot of different factors that go into, predicting records and what have you.
Yeah.
But as the roster currently stands, like Jaren and I both agreed upon, I think, you're looking about at that 44, 45 win range. And depending on how good the West is this year, obviously Jaren and I both think that it's going to be pretty damn good next year. Especially with all the guys coming back from injury and everything like that.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah, but it could be just as bad as last year, given, if there are injuries that prevail as they do every year in the NBA, and it adversely affects the West more than it does the Eastern Conference once again. So, we'll see how everything turns out. But I think that the parity in the West is at an all-time high. I think the Mavericks are somewhere in that 5 to 8 range, just depending upon how good everybody else finishes right now, because there are a lot of good teams this year, and I'm just not as confident going into this season as I was last season. But, they could easily bolster themselves into that top 4 range. I think definitively top 5 if they are able to, get a starting center and another wing, like we talked about ad nauseum throughout this podcast. But, conversely, I guess the last question I posed to you, Jaren, if things were to go haywire for the Mavericks, we're not going to forecast their impending doom to the degree of a, season-ending injury for like Luka or Kyrie that would just, completely throw the season out the window. But say like Grant Williams, gets hurt halfway through that season. He's hurt, a guy like of that caliber. If the Mavericks really experience a really unfortunate happenstance or event that occurs, what do you think that, their cap is, on this, team going into, the offseason, given, with this current rendition of this roster, if one of the better role players on this team gets hurt, kind of like what happened with Tim Hardaway Jr. In the 2022, the 2021, 22 season, where he got hurt halfway through the year against the Warriors.
Yeah, I think, this is kind of a hard question to answer, but I could see it.
Because it depends on exactly what happens.
Yeah, it depends on who, too.
Let's say it's on the level of like Grant Williams being out for the rest of the year.
Yeah, and that's, honestly become, in my opinion, and I think your opinion as well, probably the 3rd best player on this Mavericks team as it currently stands.
Should go read my article at the Smoking Cuban.
There we go. I was waiting for that shout out. No,
about why Grant Williams is poised to become such an integral part of the Mavericks next year. I talk about some clips from an interview that he did with clutchpoints.com and, some of his idols, and how he could be, how he's going to be idealistically used within the Mavericks system next year. And, the different markers that could also, bolster him to becoming an even better player than he was able to showcase in Boston. Obviously buried, not buried in the rotation, but buried behind some pretty star-studded, wings there. So I just started writing over there, and I think we can say it now. Jaren is also
official. I'm official.
Officially at the Smoking Cuban as well. So we will be plugging that basically every podcast. I'm surprised we didn't mention it earlier, to be honest with you, but we are really excited about that. But we'll talk more about that at the end of the podcast. But Jaren, of course, continue.
The floor is mine.
Yes.
But yeah, if there is someone of importance, say Grant Williams, say Tim Hardaway Jr., or even, I mean, shit, as it currently looks, Rashawn Holmes or Dwight Powell.
Yeah, exactly.
If
they're going to play valuable minutes going into next year. There's no negating that.
Yeah, but if it is someone of that importance, I could see it being a similar season to last, where the Mavericks, are fighting for a playoff spot, but ultimately just don't have enough of what it takes. And,
I don't play in maybe.
Oh yeah. Or be a play-in team. I think probably that's more realistic
this year.
Yeah. As a 9 or 10
I don't
seed.
see. Yeah. I don't see. I think that the Mavericks ended up in the play-in, largely due to the, obviously the defensive holes left in that Kyrie trade with Dorian out the door. But I mean, barring the unfortunate injury luck, that team never really got a chance to synchronize together. I even think if the Mavericks literally just copy and pasted the roster that they ended the season with last year and went into that roster, or went into the next season with that roster, at least, with Kyrie and Luka getting time in training camp together and them having a lot more increased practice and, comfortability and continuity that they would be able to carry over, I think that team would at least make the play-in.
I would confidently agree with that.
I just think that was the perfect storm of shit that happened essentially after that Dorian trade, to where they just didn't have enough time to turn the tide, and it got the tank dome.
Tank dome. But to put on my little my tinfoil hat and go on a little conspiracy here, if that absolutely does happen and it pretty much shit hits the fan, and the Mavericks do end up missing the playoffs eventually, I could see in a world where it's Jason Kidd's third season as the head coach, or becoming the third season as the head coach. Oftentimes we have seen if the head coach has not produced very many playoff wins, or at least consistent playoff wins in that third season, that, he's oftentimes booted to the curb. So I can see that.
Especially, like related to the talent of the team.
Exactly.
If Jason Kidd is, say it's mid-January and the Mavericks are like 20-24,
there could be
there's going to be. I mean, I'm very confident with Jason Kidd standing in the organization, so long as the team at least gets to 40 wins this year. I mean, because he is in that Mavs royalty tier that, I mean, God, only a few people really cross that echelon of complete allegiance from Mark Cuban. To where he would. He'd be over there to hook Jason up with anything.
With a 22-win season and Luka and Kyrie on the roster, I think he'd still be in Dallas. But I think he would likely probably be out the door. And as I said, my tinfoil hat is currently on. Ty Lue is in a contract year with the LA Clippers, and he seems to not be happy with the LA Clippers. He comes to Dallas on a big contract and leads Luka and Kyrie to that coveted championship. But let's get back on track here.
I don't think that's gonna happen.
That's probably not gonna happen. We're in the off season. We're deep into the off season. I think it's safe.
But you know what, Jaren? I think that we definitely were able to get out a lot more productive conversation than some of these podcasts last year. They weren't.
Oh, last year,
they weren't near as
Rodrigo.
They weren't near as joke filled, nor was it. I think as just bullshit filled either. So
these were serious conversations that we
were having. But did you have anything to leave up on the podcast? Because we're gonna go more in depth into what their actual place standing wise would be, and like have a full comprehensive list of like what we predict the West standings to be and where the Mavericks could be, based, and then obviously like tier out the standings and everything. But we at least wanted to get a podcast out where we sort of pseudo predicted the record and everything.
A little lighthearted version.
Yes, a little lighthearted one that didn't require near as much research, just because we're in a time crunch. Laziness on our part, but we like to get you guys the content. So
it happens.
Yeah. But, if you have anything else, Jaren, I do have one final question for you, but I'll let you speak your 2 cents if you have anything else to get.
Honestly, I'm interested to hear your question.
All right.
now that
Well,
you posed
it's pretty simplistic. But no elaboration at this point in the
No
podcast.
elaboration. Okay.
Your whole life depends on it. Plus 19,000 odds.
Okay.
I'm putting all my betting money on this record happening. I'm literally gonna go enter it verbatim into betonline.ag.
Your whole entire bank account?
Yes, and place all my money on this. What is the exact record that the Dallas Mavericks finish with next season? You have no elaboration points you can make afterwards.
Alrighty. Little drum roll. I'm gonna go with, you said no elaboration.
No.
44 and 38.
I was gonna say the exact same thing.
Oh wow.
I was gonna say that
great minds think alike.
They flipped the win-loss column last year. That's what I was gonna say as well. Yeah, the 6 wins improved.
Yeah, that's improvement. That's really good improvement.
No, that is very good improvement.
And I think that you can go into that next season with hopeful minds and hopefully a big offseason to come.
That's good improvement if they do absolutely jack shit.
But right now,
Now we need to preface this, Jaren, because we didn't really do our due diligence from this aspect. If the Mavericks do not trade for a starting center, by the start of the season and everything, do you think that move has to come before next offseason, or during next offseason, just before the start of the 2024-25 season? Or does that move need to come, within the construct of the next NBA season, like before the trade deadline?
I think yes, it does need to happen before next year begins or next year's training camp begins. But to answer the trade deadline question, I think it would be in the Mavericks' best interest to make that trade now or by the trade deadline, because I think not only teams are going to know, but I think within the Mavericks organization that there's going to be a sense of desperation rather. Within this,
there is a lot more sense of desperation
right now, but
than last year.
Yeah, than last year, absolutely. But I think if the Mavericks don't acquire a starting center, and let's say that this becomes an absolute black hole. Let's say Rashawn Holmes and Dwight Powell are clearly not poised enough to start
past their prime.
Derek Lively isn't not what we thought he was, but he's just having a little growing pains. Yeah. I could view them making some desperate moves, and that's honestly what we don't need. I think the Mavericks are still making moves with thought in mind. They need
to showcase the absolute commodity that Tim Hardaway Jr. is
Tim Hardaway needs to have another big season.
Yes.
If he is to stay on this team start of next season. But yeah, I think that this so-called center trade or starting center trade needs to happen either soon or before, in my opinion, next trade deadline. Because I think if they go into the offseason, like I said, with Dwight Powell or with Rashawn Holmes starting, or possibly Derek Lively, who knows, that there is going to be a sense of desperation within this organization. And a lot of teams are going to know that, and the asking price is going to be very, very high for whoever's available at that point in the season.
I think definitively it has to come before the trade deadline because, the trade deadline is a much more applicable and easier time to move players via trade, of course, than the offseason is. You see that this absolute stalemate with the whole Damian Lillard situation. They have infinite time to be able, to these teams before training camp to be able to just nickel and dime, players on their fake trade machines and, see how things would go. And then, on fans, and maybe they use that, but, that they have all the time in the world to, evaluate all their different options. And ultimately that could lead them to a stalemate of not knowing what to do and just wanting to, ride things out till they get to the trade deadline. I'm not saying that the Mavericks have necessarily the pressure of having to win a NBA championship this year, but with Kyrie Irving's player option in the third year, especially with Luka, approaching, his actual prime, probably within the next 2 to 3 years, I think that they have a 2-year window with this sort of current roster, if that makes sense. And just in terms of like the main core of this roster staying together throughout the next 2 years to win a championship. And if they're not able to capitalize upon that, you're either going to have to retool or somehow convince Luka to rebuild at the end of that. So, obviously we've talked ad nauseum about, given the championship window the Mavericks have and, why they need to cash in right now. Like I said, I think there's a little bit of time for interpretation and, some time to see what you have with, some of these two-way guys or, maybe, some MLE guys that they end up signing. And even if they, want to go into next season without getting that starting center, bring in a lot of guys to camp, just see who, slips through the cracks and just see if you can get away with not having to, shift around your depth and everything. And then still, improve across the board, somehow find your starting center in some sort of fashion, whether it's, Rashawn Holmes is competent enough to at least not, throw the, track of the season off, too much, or, Derek Lively is able to contribute a little bit more than we think. If one of those two things happens, then yeah, I think that the Mavericks will be poised to, be able to make a pretty comfortable trade at the trade deadline, hopefully with, one of their assets having been showcased off in a positive light from, throughout large stretches throughout the season, whether it's Maxi Kleber, Tim Hardaway Jr., whoever else they wish to ship off. But there's obviously a world in which, that doesn't happen. And maybe some guys play worse than we expect them to. They get injured and the Mavericks will have to maybe even make a move before the trade deadline. They get a little bit desperate, like Jaren said, and they got to expel a first round pick just to get a starting center. Both of those options could be what comes at the forefront, as long as they operate with what's given to them and they don't just, automatically expel unnecessary assets. But, before seeing these guys and stuff like that, then I'm cool with what they do, even if they trade for a starting center before training camp. And, not a first round pick isn't gone unless it's a guy who's, a game changer. I'm very happy with that. The main reason that I think that the Mavericks have to make this move before the trade deadline, first, second off, obviously they need to have some sort of semblance of continuity with that group, at least, heading into the 2024-25 season. If they do get that starting center, at least he will have probably played in a playoff series heading into that next season with the team. There's that. Also, the fact that it at least gives you a shot in the dark probably to make a run if everything's able to come into fruition. And I don't think that there can necessarily be a wasted year. We can view that this year in the sort of championship window that we're in more as a lead up year to the 2024-25 season. But that definitely does not mean that this is like last year where we're running down the stretch of the regular season and we're in the play-in territory. Oh, should we tank again? Like, no, like, our picks going to the Knicks this next year definitively. And, we, even if we're like the 11th seed, a game out of the playoffs with 3 games left in the regular season, like we need to be trying to win.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no sort of change of direction there like there was last year that could be applicable, despite the fact that we are coming off of a season that we went 38-44, and we are not coming off of a season in which we finished really good and, expectations are sky high. You'd almost think that this Mavericks team would have almost less expectations coming off of a downward, sort of spiral last year. But in my opinion, it only elevates the emphasis on winning, especially after the Kyrie Irving move. So it'll be a really interesting dynamic to see. But I think that given the pretty prevalent hole that the starting center position is for the Mavericks, just, more specifically, not having a veteran rim protector, I feel like, it is enough of a hole to where, especially given, how much easier it will be to get that guy, mid-season when, he's potentially disgruntled on a team or he's underperforming. I just think it's so much more easier to get a commodity like that mid-season or at the trade deadline. And I think that, the continuity aspect of that would prove too invaluable for the Mavericks to pass up on. So yes, I do think that they need to at least get, mend these issues that they have right now in terms of their, one more backup wing, whether that's through their developmental system.
Matisse Thybulle
or
at the trade deadline.
Or trade. I think that I actually think, I don't know if he can be traded to the Mavericks for like a whole year.
Oh, is that the calendar year?
I need to look at the ramifications of that. But, whether it's, getting a guy through their developmental system or, another wing on the buyout market or, obviously with the remaining portion of their MLE, they got to do that as well as get a center if they hope to sniff 50 wins, in my opinion. And they have to do that before the season starts for them to get there. Because even if they do at the trade deadline, it just may not be enough to, swing the tide in a timely manner. It could definitely bolster their playoff odds. I'm not negating that, but I think that they got to make a trade before the calendar year turns to 2024 for a starting center. Before I'm confident saying that this team's going to sniff 50 wins.
I'm comfortable with leaving the podcast off that
I
because
think that's a great
1000% believe that.
Yes.
So.
And but 44-38.
44 and 38. We'll give a good old handshake.
Yes.
Everyone's screenshot right now.
Can you name 2 Mavericks that wore the number 44 as well as the number 38?
Davis Bertans?
Yes, Davis Bertans.
Davis Bertans.
Sean Bradley.
That's a good
yes,
one. And you said 38?
Yes. And you know what? I don't know anybody with the number 38.
Nate Hinton. I'm just kidding. I don't know. But
that was bad. I think it's like 18 or something. But,
I don't know.
No, he's like 10. I could have sworn. I need to look that up after the podcast. But
I don't know who 38
we're going to end the podcast on a sentimental note because we don't know anybody with the number 38 that has played in the Mavericks in franchise history. There was probably literally a player last season that we're just missing.
There's probably
Chris Silver, shit like that.
It may have been.
But prayers out to Sean Bradley.
Yes.
Obviously, he had an accident last year, and he's been, left, relegated to a wheelchair. I hope that he continues to, be a motivational influence for everybody. Sharing his story as he has done. There's some articles in the Dallas Morning News that came out last year that you can read upon that, but prayers to him since he got mentioned in the podcast.
Prayers up.
Yes.
That's the first Sean Bradley mention, I think, ever on the Mainstream Mavs podcast.
I may have done one in a solo podcast and literally when the whole flux of Sean Bradley bicycle accident news was happening last year. Yep. But I honestly can't remember. It could be the first mention. Dare I even say the Mainstream Mavs podcast isn't here without Sean Bradley, because who knows if Dirk is the player he is today without Sean Bradley. That's the next what if scenario. If Dirk didn't have Sean Bradley on in his early years to be able to, service as the, lone 5 in that system, give Dirk the ability to expand and freelance. And freelance as a 4 on offense, something that was pedestrian to the NBA game at that time.
That is good.
Yeah. Could that have changed the trajectory of Dirk Nowitzki's career?
Jesus.
And we're just completely going to be negating individuals like Rafe LaFrentz, Eric Dampier, Dejan Ajop, all the other centers that played next to Dirk.
Exactly.
Earlier. But because they don't matter.
They don't matter. Only Sean Bradley. And in a similar note, similar to Yusuf Nurkic and Nikola Jokic in that situation in Denver, if it wasn't for Nurkic's, would Jokic be the player that he is today? There's big questions. Anyways, guys,
both from Serbia.
Both from Serbia.
All right, we're done. All right, we will catch you guys in the next one. We appreciate you guys joining us for a fun podcast at the end, a lighthearted podcast, an off-season podcast, but also a very informational podcast, at least at the start. We wanted to at least get 30 minutes of not total nonsense before we went into the total nonsense sector. So we hope you guys enjoyed it. You guys will catch us in the next one. Hopefully we will have another episode out. It's now technically August 1st, Jaren.
Happy August.
Hopefully by August 2nd. August 2nd or August 3rd at the absolute latest, we will have another episode out for you guys. We'll be much more consistent now that we have to make content out of thin air. There was a little bit of a dry period, as we had mentioned, with nothing coming out. We were kind of just waiting and seeing if news was going to come out for us to cover, and it didn't. But we are going to carry the horses, the boats, and the logs for the rest of August.
Yes, sir.
So
shout out to David Goggins.
Yeah, shout out to David Goggins. You guys stay tuned for that, of course, and make sure to get at us at the Smoking Cuban. I published my first article Wednesday on Grant Williams. Jaren will have his first article out here very soon. Within the next week, I will have an article hopefully posting in the next day or two that I'm about to work on after this podcast with Jaren.
Okay.
we're really overdoing ourselves on this one, but yes, we are both contributors over there. We're excited for that new journey, and our ability to sort of intertwine our content over there with what we're doing over here at the podcast. We got a lot of exciting ideas that we hopefully be able to hash out on a different forum for you guys, and we both want to get into this NBA media sphere. So it's a big step for us, and we really appreciate you guys helping us with this journey, because if we didn't start this podcast a little over a year ago, then we damn sure wouldn't be ready for this.
That is 1000% true.
Yeah,
we are, and we love you.
Yeah, not because we probably wouldn't be able to do it, but simply because we definitely like wouldn't be passionate about.
Wouldn't have been as passionate and would not have had the motivation to do it.
Not at all.
Yeah, I give us applause and a round of applause because I feel like we've come a long way in a year, and we have.
Yes.
I mean, look, we aren't super legit yet, but we are on our way to becoming legit and credentialed. So
yes, and this last year for the Mainstream Mavs podcast has not come without lots of negatives, lots of hardships behind the scenes that you guys have not seen. So we are, both still have real lives behind this. Our feeble 20-year-old selves are definitely not promised anything in this harsh reality that is the DFW Metroplex. So we are trying to counter on a daily basis. We may set up a GoFundMe later.
We may set up a GoFundMe,
but that
labeled not Road to Glory, Road to Credentialed.
No, we'd have to call it like the time is now, or something like that.
Playoff.
Yeah, like a playoff slogan. Something cool like that. But yeah, anyways, you can catch all our socials. Literally on Twitter. Just literally go to our Twitter at Mainstream214, and you can find both of our socials in the bio there. You can find Jaren's personal Twitter at Jaren Mavericks. You can find mine at Will Mill J. I'm gonna start actually posting on my on my regular social media Twitter, and not just strictly the podcast one. Now that I'm writing and making articles, I got to retweet that stuff. Hopefully, get more clicks. It's all about the money.
Yes, sir.
I'm just joking. Anyways, obviously for that reason. So make sure you guys go overhead and follow us on those platforms if you haven't already. I guess it's not even Twitter anymore. It's X, Jaren. I gotta update this.
Yeah, we gotta update it. Oh my god.
Oh geez, we're behind the curve too hard. This is just getting bad. We're having way too many realizations at the end of this podcast. So make sure to go do that. Follow us on X. And follow our account Mainstream214, because it obviously got hacked a couple months ago for those of you guys that don't know, and we're still in the process of regaining our prime follower base.
33% of the way there.
We are 33% of the way there, just as the Mavericks are 33% of the way to a championship.
Loading in progress.
Yes. The other 33%, comes with a wing, and then the other 33% comes with a center.
That's it.
Simple math right there.
That is simple math.
All right. But you guys can follow all our Twitters over there. Also make sure, of course, to follow the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcasts. Where there's follow, subscribe, hit that button, turn on the post notifications so you guys can stay tuned whenever we get podcasts out. If you are passionate about listening to these, we would really appreciate that. And make sure to give us a review if you do enjoy our content and want to say something appreciative, or even if it's negative feedback. We like all of it. And lastly, make sure to get us on YouTube. Shout out to the YouTube gang. Throw up the X. Throw up the X, because YouTube is the real X platform, Jaren, not Twitter.
YouTube is the real X platform.
Yes.
We're moving rocks, y'all.
Moving rocks. You guys don't even know what we're up to behind the scenes. But anyway, make sure to follow us over there. Like, comment, and subscribe at the Mainstream Mavs podcast on YouTube. Comment down below for this episode. Who is goofier between me and Jaren? A little bit on a lighthearted note. Who made you laugh more in this episode? Jaren, I think the odds right now are
the betting odds
plus 250 Will, maybe like minus 175 Jaren. You just seemed like you had a little bit more life and energy.
I had a little bit more life and energy. I'll do in part 2. I don't know if I can say this. I'll just show.
Oh, we gotta mark that out. We gotta. We can't showcase that. We may be getting more sponsors soon, guys. But yes, energy drinks definitely help Jaren counter his tiredness, because I was experiencing some at the start of this podcast, and luckily I was able to prevail through it at the end of the podcast, in the same vein that Derek Lively II is going to prevail through his his woes and his confidence and the potential shortcomings he could experience on the defensive end at the start of the 2023-2024 NBA season. By the end of it, he will prevail, just like I did in this podcast, to becoming the Mavericks starting center. So with that great point of emphasis, Jaren, I think that we haven't left out anything else on the table.
I really don't think we've left anything else on the table
for once.
Yes.
We will catch you guys in the next one. Mainstream Mavs signing out.
Bye bye.